what do we do when we can't be present in the room is the question, right? And some of the ways that pastors can do that is very similar to the ways that they're supporting their own congregations now, right? In terms of, one of the big things is using this technology in ways that can create that kind of connection. But a lot of these connections to patients who are responsive, considering that some patients just simply aren't going to be responsive. And so we have to rely on those folks who are in the room or family members who can get in, like Dr. Delgado says. Seems to be some policy in letting family members in, and even some clergy to that extent. And so I think now maybe that's the case more than when the pandemic first started. But it's really taking advantage of, how do we do rituals from a distance, and things like prayer and continuing those kinds of things. I think really helping patients tap into some of their own spiritual resources. Music is something that is always a good option. Sending scripture and prayer, by mail or through other means are some good suggestions to offer that kind of spiritual support that cannot be done in person. And just really being mindful of the ways in which clergy provide care in general, right? Just being prepared to answer some of the hard questions in different ways, whether that's by Skype or FaceTime or whatever those are for patients who can be somewhat responsive, or helping the family members who can get in the room facilitate some of those kind of interactions. And sending bulletins if they're attached to a church or a congregation for communion and the ritual, the sacrament of communion, ways to, as safe as possible to do that. I know what we're doing with my church is we're having communion on our own. So we create our own wine and juice. And so that would be something that, clergy can do for, to support end of life care in that way, the way in which the resources in the room become the most powerful thing that we have, right? And how do we tap into that as clergy in ways that can be just as sacred, right? Then our physical presence, of course. Physical presence is something that we value, and as a professor, I definitely teach that. And so it's something that I have to think about as I'm preparing to teach my students in the fall. About now, what does ministry look like when we cannot be present? And how do we get creative in ways that, as we know, God's presence can still be evident even if we're not in the room? And so how do we make that clear to patients who are perhaps missing that connection in some way? So it's not just the end of life. It's also sort of this way in which the grieving aspect can be exasperated in these situations. And so really just being more attentive to that as well, without the option of having a clergy or limited family members who sometimes provide the spiritual care to family members as well. But it really, I think, taking advantage of these creative ways in which we can offer support, scriptures or notes, just to let that person know that they're not alone, and just really being phone calls are things that they're very helpful. I sat on a panel when the pandemic first started by the Hospice Foundation of America. So I recommend that anybody who's doing ministry tap into that. They do have the recording and all of the other information that they share, which was really wonderful about now some of the ways in which clergy can do virtual ministry. So thinking of now adding that repertoire to the ways in which we do pastoral care, because it's not going to go away. We don't have no idea when this pandemic is going to ease itself. And so it's something that we do have to acclimate ourselves to and really think about how can we make God's presence evident in the room and really tap into patients' own resources. Now, for the ones who are non-responsive, maybe a little bit more challenging, but some of the same principles can apply. Music was often something that we brought to patients, whether it was their favorite gospel song or favorite, music, whatever the Christian music, or something that brought them comfort by just hearing that, we would bring that to them. And so that's something that can also be facilitated with the folks on the ground. So now it's really a very intentional partnership with these essential workers who are in the hospital